What if the first weapon ever forged did not come from any human mind? What if it was handed down by a teacher who should never have entered the world? The first blade in this story is not born from battle or tribal revenge. It begins as a secret, lowered from above into hands not ready to hold it. An angel opens the earth and shows men what sleeps beneath their feet. Hidden ore becomes future bloodshed. Metal becomes a promise of organized force. A stone becomes a shield. A blade becomes an argument. A city becomes prey. Fear stops being an emotion and becomes architecture, walls built from suspicion. But the forbidden lesson does not end with swords and shields and armor. The same fallen intelligence teaches beauty, enchantment, cosmetics, hidden signs. The body becomes engineered, decorated, sharpened, and made dangerous. Flesh itself is reforged into something that commands attention before it speaks. The sky becomes readable, no longer wonder, but a code to control fate. The earth becomes harvestable, not only for food, but for power and status. And humanity, still young, learns that creation can be turned against itself. This is the darker version of the Watcher's story from the Book of Enoch. Not simply angels taking human wives, not simply giants under a violent sky. That is the visible disaster, the part everyone remembers and retells first. The deeper disaster is knowledge. Before the flood, there is instruction. Before judgment, there is a classroom, and the students do not yet understand. They are becoming evidence, each lesson a nail in the coffin of the old world. Before the world is washed clean, it is taught how to become unclean. The Book of Enoch gives this corruption a name, and the name is Azazel, not a demon crawling up from some underworld pit, but an angel from above. He does not destroy humanity by force or by possessing every living soul. He destroys by making humanity more capable, giving desire the tools to become history. That is why the story still feels disturbingly modern and uncomfortably close. Because the worst thing heaven can give mankind is not always punishment. Sometimes it is progress without conscience, advancement without restraint. A sword can be taken away from one violent hand, one weak-minded man. But the idea of the sword cannot be undone once the hand remembers the shape. A spell can be forbidden by priests and kings and every council of elders. But the hunger to bend reality survives in every whispered forbidden word. A star chart can be burned in a sacred fire, reduced to ash and silence. But the belief that fate can be controlled remains inside the mind forever. The Watchers did not merely fall and leave behind a memory of their descent. They left tools behind, and tools become teachers after their makers disappear. Tools for war, tools for desire, tools for prediction, tools for domination. Once those tools entered human history, they became impossible to separate from it. This is not the story of angels who attacked mankind from the outside. It is the story of angels who upgraded mankind in the wrong direction entirely, accelerating civilization toward a judgment no one saw coming until the water rose. And the most terrifying part is not that humanity learned, and learned quickly. The most terrifying part is that humanity liked the lesson from the very start, because power always feels like rescue before it becomes a sentence of its own. That is why the opening image should feel like discovery and contamination at once. The angel is not screaming in rebellion or rage against the heavens above. He is calmly explaining how the world can be used, measured, extracted, conquered. The horror is instructional, almost patient, because the student does not know the price. By the time the first blade cools in the open air, the old world has already ended. Though no one has noticed the funeral, no one has mourned what was lost. Chapter 1. The first technology of ruin. The Watchers were supposed to observe the human world from above, from distance. That is what their name implies. Beings who watch, beings who remain awake and apart. But in the Enochic story, watching is not enough for them. Distance becomes desire. Desire becomes a decision, and the decision becomes a descent that changes everything. They descend together. 200 angels gathered around one forbidden act of rebellion. A conspiracy wide enough to stain the mountain where heaven and earth nearly touch. The story places them on Mount Hermon, a height between the celestial and the mortal, where geography itself becomes a broken threshold. A border that was never meant to cross. It is the perfect place for a boundary to be shattered beyond any hope of repair. They do not stumble into sin like confused mortals who lose their way in the dark. They organize it, they plan it, they know the descent is dangerous and irreversible, so they bind themselves by oath, turning rebellion into a sworn institution of darkness. No one will abandon the others when punishment begins its inevitable descent from above. No one will leave one leader to carry the whole accusation alone on his shoulders. This is the first chilling detail in the fall, the detail most readers overlook entirely. Corruption begins not as chaos but as agreement, as if sin becomes stronger when organized. The Watchers make rebellion administrative, collective, structured, and almost legalistic. Semyaza fears becoming the only one condemned for a crime they all chose together. The others answer by making guilt communal, shared equally, inescapable for everyone. They turn disobedience into a covenant of darkness, and the mountain becomes a courtroom. The first courtroom of their guilt, where the verdict was written before the trial began. Then they cross the line that should have remained untouched, sealed, and inviolable. They take human wives, and from those unions come the Nephilim, the giants of old. The giants become the obvious horror, towering above the human world like walking ruins. But giants are only the visible wound, the scar that everyone sees and points to first. The deeper infection enters through instruction, through lessons that outlive any body. Azazel appears not first as a warrior, brandishing some celestial weapon of destruction. He appears as a teacher, which makes him more dangerous than any enemy on the field. He teaches men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates for organized combat, giving violence both an edge and a uniform, turning chaos into something repeatable. He reveals the metals hidden within the earth and the working of them, the secret craft, the secret grammar of ore, heat, and force, the language that turns rock into weapon. That means his gift is not one weapon, not one blade forged for one hand to wield. It is repeatable violence, a method any ambitious hand can inherit and pass forward. It is the method by which violence can be manufactured again and again and again. A sword is a single object, limited to the one who holds it, bound to one moment. Metallurgy is a future, and futures are harder to bury than any single blade ever made. A shield is a single defense, protecting one body from one blow in one encounter. Armor is an entire expectation that the body will soon be attacked without question. A prophecy of violence hammered into wearable form, worn like a second skin of dread. Azazel does not merely arm one generation of fighters and then withdraw from the world. He changes what future generations will consider normal, expected, and unavoidable. Before his teaching, metal sleeps beneath rock and soil, untouched and without purpose. After his teaching, metal waits for human intention, for ambition, for the will to strike. The forge becomes an altar without calling itself one, sacred in its destruction. Smoke rises for incense. Sparks fly like corrupted stars falling from a broken heaven. Men gather around heat and smoke and hammer and the glowing ore that promises power. They learn to strike the earth until it answers in usable force, in shaped violence. This is sacred theft disguised as craft, nature's bones repurposed for human conflict. The bones of the world are pulled upward and forced into forms that cause suffering, dragged from silence into screaming history, from deep rock into the light of the forge. A blade is not merely sharpened matter, not just metal ground to an edge for cutting. It is fear given a clean edge, an argument sharpened until negotiation falls away. A breastplate is not merely protection, not just metal shaped to shield the chest. It is proof that the human body now belongs to an age of organized and expected threat. A shield does not only save the person holding it in the heat of a sudden battle, it announces that attack has become a permanent assumption woven into daily existence. This is why Azazel's lesson is so devastating and so difficult to undo or reverse. It changes not one act, but the imagination of what is possible, what is inevitable. He teaches humanity to expect violence, prepare for violence, and perfect violence, until conflict becomes a permanent design principle of civilization itself, built in, Once that cycle begins, innocence cannot return unchanged or remain what it once was. Every tool creates the world that needs that tool, and every generation forgets this truth. They mistake that world for normal life, for the way things have always been and must be. The sword creates the warrior who seeks battle and defines himself through the blade. The breastplate creates the battlefield where such armor becomes necessity, not choice. Both create the next fear that justifies them, the next threat that demands their use. The shield creates the expectation of the next blow falling from an unknown direction. The forge creates a society that gathers around controlled destruction as sacred ritual. And the angel watches human beings become impressed with their own new and terrible strength. This is not progress as comfort, not advancement toward peace or understanding or rest. This is progress as acceleration toward judgment, speed without direction or wisdom. The Watchers drag mankind forward faster than wisdom can grow or conscience can adapt. They give technique to creatures still ruled by appetite, fear, and the hunger for status. They give power to hands that have not yet learned restraint or the weight of consequence. And the hands mistake ability for permission, skill for right, power for destiny. That is the oldest nightmare of technology, repeated in every age since that first forge. Not that it fails, breaks, or turns useless in the moment of greatest need or crisis. That it works perfectly in corrupted hands, rewarding the very impulses that should fall silent. But the Enochic accusation against Azazel grows stranger and more unsettling still. He does not only teach weapons of war, the instruments of death and battlefield ruin. He teaches ornaments, bracelets, precious stones, dyes, and the beautifying of the eyes. At first, these details feel smaller than swords and shields, almost decorative and trivial, almost harmless, almost easy to dismiss as minor details beside the larger crimes of war. That is exactly why they are dangerous, and that is exactly the point of their inclusion. The text places beauty beside warfare deliberately, as if blade and mirror share one origin. Blade and mirror belong to the same corruption, fed by the same forbidden river of knowledge. One conquers through fear, forcing submission through the threat of pain and destruction. The other conquers through desire, and desire can enslave without ever leaving a visible mark. One reshapes the world around the body, building walls and weapons to dominate from outside. The other reshapes how the body is seen, building masks and surfaces to dominate from within. Beauty becomes engineered, not innocent, not the spontaneous gift of the natural world. The face becomes a surface of influence, a mask built to command attention and demand worship. The eye becomes a weapon without needing steel, a glance that controls without touching. Jewelry becomes visible hierarchy, gold and gems declaring rank before a single word is spoken. Color becomes seduction, and wealth begins speaking long before truth can find its voice. Precious stones become condensed power worn on the skin, glittering symbols of possession. Small, bright badges of rank that tell the world who commands and who must stand aside and obey. Azazel teaches mankind that appearance can rule before truth speaks, before truth even arrives. A decorated body can command attention while a plain one is ignored or forgotten entirely. A glittering ruler can seem chosen by the heavens even when nothing holy has chosen him. A painted eye can pull desire into obedience without the target ever knowing they surrendered. The same teacher who arms the hand also arms the gaze, because domination does not always need blood. That is why this episode should not reduce the Watchers to simple monsters howling in the dark. Their horror is more intimate than fangs or claws or burning celestial fury. They do not simply unleash beasts into the world to crush and devour at random. They change the way humans understand value, teaching the species to confuse radiance with legitimacy. The powerful can now look powerful without being worthy of any power they hold. The dangerous can now look sacred without a single holy thing inside their hollow forms. The crowd may never learn the difference between gold and the light that gold reflects. The corrupt can now look magnificent, shining with borrowed glory they did not earn. Violence can be polished until it resembles civilization, law, ceremony, procession, crown. and corruption can shine brightly enough that people kneel before it without asking why. That is the first technology of ruin, the original corruption no one recognizes. Not the sword alone, the entire system built around the sword to justify its existence. The forge, the ornament, the armor, the status, the fear, the desire, the worship. Azazel gives humanity power it can wear, carry, display, and reproduce at will, turning corruption into culture, and culture into something people call natural and eternal. Once that happens, the fall is no longer only angelic, something far away and above. It becomes cultural, inherited, repeated by every generation that follows the first. The lesson is practical enough to be repeated, which makes it more dangerous than a miracle. Because repetition becomes inheritance, and inheritance becomes invisible tradition. A miracle ends when the divine presence withdraws back behind the veil of heaven, but a technique remains inside human hands, passed down, refined, never questioned again. Every apprentice can become another transmitter, another small continuation of the original trespass. The Watchers do not only give humanity objects to hold and admire and fear. They give humanity processes that reproduce themselves without any angel present to guide them. That is why the forge should feel less like a workshop and more like a contaminated sanctuary. The hammer becomes a ritual drum beating out the rhythm of the new age. The sparks become fallen stars descending into the world they were never meant to reach. The ore becomes testimony, pulled from silence into the light of invention and intent. No priest has blessed this fire, yet men gather around it like worshippers at an altar. Their faces glow with awe because power always feels sacred before consequences arrive. Consequences always arrive late, wearing the name of judgment, speaking the language of reckoning. This is how the first forbidden technology seduces the human world without resistance. It works before it explains itself. It gives before it takes. It impresses before it destroys. Chapter 2. The sword was only the beginning. The sword is the first obvious sign that the lesson has gone wrong and cannot be reversed. But it is not the last sign. It is only the first visible symptom of a wider contamination. Other Watchers teach other forbidden systems, each one opening a different wound in the world. One teaches enchantments, turning speech into a tool of hidden force and silent coercion. Where language once stopped at the ear, it now reaches past the ear into the will. Another teaches root cuttings, pulling secret power from living things buried beneath the soil. The plant world becomes weaponized, every root a potential poison, remedy, or cursed doorway. Another teaches astrology, making the heavens appear legible, usable, and exploitable, as if eternity were a manual written for human advantage and ambition alone. Others teach the signs of the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, and the shifting clouds. The world no longer remains a place to inhabit with wonder and simple gratitude. It becomes a layered system waiting to be exploited, decoded, and turned into leverage. It becomes a machine to interpret, and every interpretation becomes a claim of power. Every root may conceal a force, a remedy, a poison, a charm, or a forbidden key. Every cloud may carry a message meant only for those who know how to read the sky. Every star may hide a command, and every command requires an interpreter with authority. Every season may be treated as evidence in an invisible court no one can escape. This is where the corruption becomes cosmic, stretching from the dirt to the stars. Azazel opens the earth, and the others open the sky, trapping humanity between two stolen revelations. Humanity stands between two stolen libraries, one below and one above, both forbidden. Below, metal waits to become a weapon, to be shaped by fire and human ambition. Above, stars wait to become instructions, deadlines, permissions, warnings, and accusations. The body is decorated, the battlefield is armed, and the future is questioned on all sides. Nothing remains neutral after the Watchers teach. Nothing stays innocent or untouched. The ground is no longer only ground, something to walk on and build upon safely. The heavens are no longer only heavens, something to gaze at and feel small beneath. Creation becomes a manual for power. a reference book for those who seek advantage. That is the second forbidden lesson, and it cuts deeper than any blade ever forged. Knowledge is never satisfied with merely seeing the world as it presents itself openly. Once corrupted, knowledge wants to manage what it sees, to control and reorganize it. It wants leverage. It wants timing. It wants advantage over others who see less, because curiosity has become strategy, and wonder has become a weapon of the informed. It wants to know what will happen before the helpless know, and sell that knowledge. It wants to command the world by understanding where the hidden seams and fractures lie. The Watchers do not give mankind one corrupt act that fades with time and memory. They give mankind an entire grammar of control, a language that rewrites reality itself. They give mankind a new relationship with reality, one built on extraction and leverage. And after that, ignorance may be terrifying, but at least ignorance leaves some doors sealed. But knowledge becomes worse when it teaches the hand exactly where to force the lock. The lesson expands outward until every layer of creation appears to contain a usable secret. The question is no longer whether mankind can survive the world with courage and faith, but whether mankind can exploit it before someone else does, and call that survival. An exploitation, once sanctified by angelic instruction, begins to feel like destiny itself. But destiny, once it feels natural, is the hardest cage to recognize, let alone escape. Chapter 3. When the Sky Became a Weapon. Imagine the first human standing beneath a watcher after sunset. The world still young. The night is quiet, but the angel's presence makes the quiet feel deliberate and heavy, as if the darkness itself is listening, waiting for the lesson it was always meant to receive. Above them, the stars burn in arrangements older than any city mankind will ever build. Before this moment, those lights may have been wonder, navigation, poetry, or prayer to the viewer. Then the watcher begins naming them, and every name lowers heaven closer to human use. He points at a cluster and speaks. This one governs the season of floods and harvest. He traces a line across the dark and declares, "This one marks when rulers fall and rise." A constellation becomes a sign. The moon becomes a schedule, and the future feels supervised. The sun becomes an authority. The sky stops being distant and becomes readable, usable, ownable. That is the real horror of forbidden astrology in this story, far beyond horoscope pages. Not a harmless curiosity about personality traits printed in soft and entertaining language. A sacred ceiling becomes a system of pressure, an invisible roof pressing down on every choice. If the heavens can be read, then fear can be organized, sold, weaponized, and inherited. If fear can be organized, people can be ruled through signs they cannot verify or resist. The one who claims to interpret the sky controls the one who fears what it says. Because terror always seeks a translator, and the translator always names a price for peace. A king can say the stars approved his war, placing cosmic authority behind human ambition. A priest can say the eclipse condemned his enemies, and the frightened crowd calls revenge holy. A sorcerer can sell certainty to those terrified of uncertainty, and the silence of the unknown. A child can be born under dread before taking a first breath, already accused by the calendar. A marriage can be chosen by calculation instead of love, by alignment instead of affection. A death can be expected because someone claimed the pattern demanded a sacrifice. This turns heaven into politics. It turns time into accusation, destiny into a rigged document. As if fate were a document only rulers and readers can interpret for their own advantage. It turns the future into property held by those who claim secret sight over others. That is what makes the Watcher's teaching dangerous beyond the supernatural and the spectral. Forbidden knowledge produces hierarchy, the oldest and most durable structure of oppression. Those who know stand above those who must believe, and belief becomes obedience without proof. Those who read the sign gain power over those who wait for the sign in fear. The universe becomes a courtroom where most humans cannot read the charges against them. They can only feel the verdict approaching, cold and certain, from a sky they cannot question. Only the initiated can explain why disaster came, and their explanation always serves them. Only the initiated can tell you when to fear, when to wait, when to act, when to submit. Only the initiated can decide whether hope is allowed this season or withheld until the next. This is not enlightenment, no matter how brightly the stars shine above the altar of interpretation. It is dependence dressed as revelation, a chain forged from symbols instead of iron. The Watchers teach enchantments too, and that changes speech itself from the inside out. Words stop being only communication, the gentle exchange of thought between equal minds. They become instruments, levers, mechanisms, each syllable carrying a hidden mechanical force. A name becomes something that can summon, bind, threaten, or protect the speaker and the target. No longer sound, but leverage. No longer breath, but a key turning in an invisible lock. A curse becomes pressure applied toward the unseen, a force that does not need a physical weapon. A vow becomes more than a social promise between neighbors who share the same valley. A whispered formula becomes a door someone may regret opening when something answers back. This turns ordinary human life unstable at its very root, at the level of daily speech. Every household contains speech. Every marketplace contains negotiation, oaths, suspicion, fear. Every court contains oath. Every prayer contains names that should not be spoken carelessly. Every lover's promise contains a possible binding neither party fully understands. If words can move hidden forces, then no sentence is entirely safe, not even whispered ones. Silence becomes a desperate form of protection, the only defense against a language that bites. A blessing may conceal a mechanism, a hidden trigger buried inside the warmth of the words. A curse may linger longer than anger, outliving the person who first spoke it in fury. A secret name may carry more weight than an army, more force than 1,000 drawn swords. This is the Watcher's contamination at its most intimate and most inescapable form, because it enters the mouth before it enters the battlefield, the home before the city wall. The mouth becomes a ritual tool, the tongue a blade that cuts without visible wound. The human voice becomes a lever pressed against invisible machinery no one built or chose. And when that belief enters a culture, suspicion follows it everywhere like a loyal shadow. People begin fearing not only weapons but words, not only enemies but glances, not only storms but signs, not only disease but hidden causes behind the visible disease. The Watchers do not simply make the world more violent, more bloody, more openly cruel. They make it more interpretable, and therefore more frightening at every hour of the day. An uninterpreted world can still feel mysterious and open, full of possibility and wonder. An overinterpreted world becomes suffocating, crowded with meanings that never sleep or rest. Every event begins to mean too much, to carry weight far beyond its surface. A bird crossing the sky becomes a warning. A shadow becomes a sign of approaching judgment. A coincidence becomes evidence. A failed harvest becomes a sentence passed from above. A dream becomes an invasion, not of the body, but of the territory of the mind. A fever becomes evidence of unseen hostility, a battle fought in a realm no eye can see. The mind loses rest because everything might be a message, and every message might be a threat. That is a different kind of destruction, slower but deeper than any blade could reach. A blade kills the body and ends the suffering in one decisive and final moment. A corrupted sign system occupies the mind, forcing the soul to patrol invisible dangers forever. One wound bleeds and eventually stops, scarred but surviving with time and patience. The other keeps watching the sky for permission to live, for permission to breathe freely. This is why the Watcher's forbidden knowledge creates a broader horror than any giant could. Giants can be seen. Giants can be feared directly, faced with weapons and walls and courage. Giants can be named as threats standing outside the village gate, visible and mortal. But systems enter the village through the front door, welcomed as progress and protection. And once inside, they do not need to look like enemies to control every life they touch. The ornament maker becomes fashionable. The root cutter becomes useful. The interpreter of clouds becomes important before every decision. The forbidden lesson spreads because it solves immediate human anxieties, and urgency is where corruption learns to hide. That is how corruption survives across generations. It does not need to look evil if it feels useful, protective, profitable. Weapons protect against enemies. Ornaments establish status and command. Astrology promises certainty. Enchantments offer control over the unseen. Root knowledge offers hidden remedies alongside hidden dangers. Every forbidden gift arrives with a practical excuse attached. Humans rarely choose corruption because it announces itself as corruption. They choose the version that arrives carrying solutions to their fear. They choose it because it works, and success numbs conscience faster than failure. They choose it because it solves something faster than righteousness ever could. They choose it because fear demands tools immediately, without delay. And once a tool becomes useful, people begin defending its existence. That defense becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity and belonging. Identity becomes something no generation wants to surrender or abandon. This is how the Watchers disappear into the normal world forever. Their names grow distant. Their teachings remain close and operational. A man may no longer remember Azazel, but he still trusts the blade. A ruler may not speak of fallen angels or their descent, but he still wraps himself in gold, color, and visible power. A frightened household may never read Enoch or know his story, but it still fears the curse, the omen, and the wrong word. A city may reject myth and call it primitive superstition, but it still builds systems around force, status, prediction, and control. That is the genius of the Watchers' corruption. It outlives belief in them. The forbidden teaching becomes stronger when people stop calling it forbidden. Then comes the part that makes the story feel less like fantasy and more like indictment. The world changes, not in one night, not with one scream. Slowly, through repeated lessons, each one deepening the wound. A blade passed from teacher to apprentice across the forge. A chart copied onto another surface by candlelight. A charm whispered from one mouth to another in the dark. A technique preserved because somebody benefited from keeping it alive. The Watchers teach humanity once. Humanity teaches itself forever. This is the moment the fall becomes irreversible and complete. Because the original angels are no longer required for the corruption. Their knowledge has entered human reproduction, memory, trade, and ambition. Becoming a nervous system beneath civilization, invisible but essential. It no longer descends from heaven. It rises from within civilization, and when heaven finally looks down, it will not see one rebel on a mountain. It will see an entire world altered by the lesson beyond recognition. A planet where the students have become instructors, teaching their own children. This is the psychological prison built by celestial knowledge without consent. The future becomes a threat with a schedule written in the stars. People begin living in advance of disasters they believe are already written. They do not need chains if fear makes them arrange their own lives around omens. The sky becomes a ruler that never speaks directly to anyone, forcing interpreters to become its earthly mouth with absolute authority. This gives the interpreter a terrifying kind of power over the fearful, because ambiguity always needs a priesthood to translate its meaning. The more unclear the sign, the more authority belongs to the one who explains it. That is how forbidden knowledge turns mystery into dependence and dependence into control. The Watchers have not merely shown humanity the stars and their patterns. They have created a class of gatekeepers standing between people and meaning. These gatekeepers stand between ordinary people and the meaning of their own lives. Even resistance becomes difficult and almost impossible to attempt, because refusing the interpretation can be framed as refusing heaven itself. That is the perfect trap. A human system wearing the authority of the sky. And once that trap exists, every crisis strengthens it further. Every disaster becomes proof that the interpreters were right all along. Every misfortune becomes evidence that more obedience is required, not less. Chapter 4. The earth became the witness. The corruption grows beyond private sin and becomes visible from heaven, large enough to be read from the throne room distance without magnification. The story says bloodshed spreads across the earth, not as an accident, but as the harvest of instruction, the crop that forbidden teaching produced. Lawlessness is not hidden in one tribe, one valley, or one violent family. It covers the world enough for archangels to see it clearly from above. Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel look down from the highest reaches. They do not see progress. They see evidence, patterns, consequences. They see the signature of forbidden teaching on every horizon. The earth itself becomes the witness, as if soil can remember. Remember what human hands try to hide beneath ritual and monument. Every field of violence becomes testimony written in ash and ruin. Every body returned to dust becomes a statement presented before heaven. Every city armed by forbidden knowledge becomes part of the accusation. The archangels do not need rumor or second-hand reports from the ground. They do not need human witnesses protected in a courtroom of mortal law. The planet has become the record, and the record is devastating. That image gives the story its cosmic dread and its terrible weight. Humanity thinks its violence is horizontal, confined to victims and borders, one person against another, one tribe against another in the valley, one city against another across the river, across the mountain pass. But in the story, every act also moves vertically toward judgment, rising beyond the visible world, climbing past the clouds and the firmament. It reaches the gates of heaven like smoke from an altar that never stops burning. The cries of the world become impossible to ignore or dismiss. The watchers taught, humans learned. The earth suffered the consequence, and suffering became the language heaven could not turn away from. Now the ground itself demands judgment with a voice older than any human tongue. And here the delay becomes horrifying in its silence and duration. Heaven does not intervene before the lesson spreads across the earth. That delay gives the horror time to become civilization, to become normal. Weapons have time to multiply across every forge in every settlement. Enchantment has time to enter speech and reshape how humans speak. Astrology has time to shape fear into daily habit and ritual practice. Adornment has time to become hierarchy, rank, and visible human worth. Power has time to become culture, inherited and defended without question. By the time judgment arrives, corruption is no longer a single event. It is a pattern with institutions built around it, protecting it, feeding it. It is a system, and systems are harder to judge than single sinners. The knowledge is already taught from hand to hand without angelic presence. The Watchers may have started the classroom in the shadows of Mount Hermon, but humanity has become the school, the teacher, and the curriculum at once. That means judgment cannot simply punish the original teachers and be done. It must confront a world already remade by them beyond easy recognition. And a remade world is not easily unmade by a single decree from above. This is why the archangel's downward gaze should feel colder than any battlefield. They are not shocked by human weakness or human appetite for destruction. They are measuring the consequence of angelic interference in mortal affairs. The evidence is not one fallen body or one ruined city on the plain, one screaming survivor or one grieving mother in the ashes of her home. The evidence is the condition of the entire world after forbidden knowledge matured, after it grew roots deep enough to survive any flood, any fire, any reckoning. Chapter 5. The Sentence Beneath the Desert. When judgment finally comes, it does not arrive as a conversation, because the evidence has already spoken louder than any defense could. Heaven does not ask Azazel to explain his intentions or his methods. There is no council where the fallen teacher defends progress as virtue. There is only sentence. Raphael receives the command, and mercy withdraws. Azazel is to be bound hand and foot, the teacher reduced to helplessness. The one who opened the earth's secrets is now unable to open anything at all. An opening is made in the desert. The place is called Dudael, a wound in the wilderness carved by divine authority for a single prisoner. Rough and jagged stones are placed over him, not polished like his ornaments, not beautiful like the metals he taught men to admire and desire, but raw like judgment itself, unadorned, unsoftened by ceremony or mercy. His face is covered so he cannot see light ever again. The revealer of shining ornaments is sentenced to absolute deprivation of light, the one who showed humanity how to extract brilliance from the earth. is now sealed beneath the earth's weight in total darkness forever. The punishment is not random, it is symbolic precision, each detail an answer. The teacher of hidden metals is buried under stone, returned beneath the earth. The very earth he taught mankind to violate and extract from without restraint. The one who opened the earth becomes trapped inside it, enclosed by its weight. The revealer of shining ornaments is denied the sight of light permanently. The giver of weapons is held down by roughness sharper than any mercy he showed. The angel who taught humanity to extract power from creation is sealed by creation. The desert swallows the instructor, but not the instruction, and that is the wound. That separation is the deepest wound in the entire myth, the one that never heals. Binding Azazel does not unmake the sword, because memory has replaced his presence. It does not erase the forge from human memory or the heat from human ambition. It does not remove ornament from the skin of rulers or the gloss from their words. It does not silence every charm whispered after sunset in every valley and village. It does not close the sky after astrology has taught men to read it for advantage. The teacher can be chained and sealed beneath the desert. The lesson cannot. Not once it has multiplied inside human hands and been passed to the next generation. This is the central horror of the entire episode, the truth the story leaves behind. Heaven can punish a being, but can heaven erase an idea after humans love it? Dudael receives Azazel into darkness. The world keeps the curriculum intact. Every forge that burns afterward becomes an echo of his first lesson in the dirt. Each spark a tiny rebellion repeating itself across the centuries of human craft. Every sharpened edge becomes a small remembrance of the original corruption. Whether the smith knows the name Azazel or not, the shape of the blade remembers. Every jeweled crown becomes a glittering trace of the same fallen instruction. Every painted eye becomes a soft continuation of the angelic trespass into beauty. Every omen read in the stars repeats the watcher's stolen grammar of the sky. The name may vanish from human memory and from every book of record. The mechanism remains, operating without needing its creator's name or presence. That is how forbidden knowledge survives history without being detected. It removes its own fingerprints and becomes technique, ordinary and accepted. It detaches from the forbidden source and becomes ordinary craft and tradition. It becomes profession. It becomes inheritance. It becomes the way things are done. A blacksmith does not need to worship Azazel to preserve the curse of the forge. Utility can preserve a curse without any liturgy, without any prayer or altar. A king does not need to invoke the watchers to benefit from their original gifts. A soldier does not need to believe in Enoch to carry the consequence of his teaching. A frightened mother does not need to know the angel who taught enchantments. The blade still cuts. The crown still dazzles. The sign still terrifies without origin. The whispered word still carries dread long after the name behind it is forgotten. Chapter 6. The Lesson That Survived the Flood. Humanity no longer needs the fallen angels to continue their work. That may be why the punishment is described with such severity and precision. Heaven is not merely punishing disobedience or correcting a single rebel. It is sealing a source, bearing a contamination point after the contamination spreads. Sealing the source after the plague has already learned to walk on its own. That bloodstream is human civilization, running red with the lesson. The broader flood tradition intensifies this reading beyond argument. Judgment washes the world. Noah survives the water. Human history begins again through a narrow and trembling remnant. But the question remains like a shadow beneath the ark's hull. What survives inside the survivors, hiding in their memory and hands? Water can erase cities, pull walls apart, grind stone back to sand. Water can remove bodies from the streets and silence a generation entirely. But can water erase knowledge once it has entered memory and habit? Can a flood drown an idea that has already taught the hand to use it? Can judgment cleanse a tool when the hand remembers how to forge it? This is where the Watcher's story becomes more frightening than any monster myth. A monster can die, a giant can fall and crumble into dust. A city can burn until nothing remains but ash and silence. But a method can survive in the mind of one single person. One survivor is enough to carry a technique across the water. One technique is enough to rebuild the forbidden world from nothing. One remembered pattern is enough to reconstruct an entire system of power. One hidden page is enough to restart an entire forbidden tradition. That is the possible horror waiting after the flood recedes, not that everything remained. That enough remained to restart the cycle. Enough metalwork, enough ornament, enough omen reading and star worship, enough magical thinking, enough hunger for control over the unseen, enough memory of what angelic corruption had made possible and profitable. The post-flood world may not be clean, no matter how deep the water rose. It may only be restarted, with older contamination hidden inside newer hands. And if it is restarted with contaminated memory, then judgment is not the end. It is the next chapter of the same story, repeated with different names. Azazel's prison becomes a dark mirror, reflecting beneath all of human history. While he lies under jagged stone, humans walk under open sky above him. They still use the vertical world his teaching first opened for them. He cannot see light, but they use the light of the forge every morning. He cannot move his hands, but their hands keep shaping metal into weapons. He cannot decorate his face, but their courts glitter with stolen brilliance. He cannot point toward the stars or read their arrangements anymore, but their priests, kings, and seekers continue looking upward for advantage. This is the cruel irony at the center of his punishment and his triumph. He loses the world. His influence does not lose the world. He is made blind beneath the desert, sealed in absolute darkness. But the world still sees through methods he taught and perfected. He is denied all motion, bound hand and foot by divine sentence. But his knowledge continues traveling through every forge and marketplace. He is sealed away from all human contact and conversation. But his lesson remains unsealed, traveling through culture like fire through grass. That is why Azazel functions as more than a character in an old story. He is a buried origin, the kind civilization depends on and refuses to name. He is the hidden source behind a question humanity still cannot answer honestly. When does knowledge become corruption? Not when it is false or misleading, because falsehood is often easier to expose and discard than comfortable truth. Often, knowledge becomes corruption when it is true and misused deliberately, when accuracy serves appetite instead of wisdom, technique instead of conscience, not when it fails or breaks down or proves unreliable in practice. Often, corruption deepens when forbidden knowledge succeeds too well. A sword succeeds when it cuts through flesh without resistance or hesitation. A spell succeeds when it manipulates belief without the target ever noticing. A star system succeeds when it organizes fear into obedience and payment. A symbol of beauty succeeds when it commands desire and status without effort. The Watcher's gifts are frightening precisely because they are effective tools. They give humanity tools that work before humanity understands the cost of use. And that is the ancient warning sharpened for the modern world we live in. Human beings are not destroyed only by weakness or by visible enemies. Sometimes they are destroyed by capacity, by becoming too capable too fast, by becoming able to do what conscience cannot yet govern or even question, and then calling that dangerous ability destiny, progress, or advancement, by reaching power before reaching wisdom to wield it with restraint, by confusing permission with possibility, ability with right, skill with virtue, by treating every hidden thing as something that should be opened and owned. The Watchers cross that line first, descending from observation to instruction. Then humanity repeats the pattern endlessly across every generation that follows. Open the earth and extract. Read the sky and exploit. Cut the root and weaponize. Speak the word and control. Forge the blade and arm. Decorate the body and dominate. Command the future and fear what you have commanded without understanding. Each act feels like mastery, like progress, like civilization advancing forward. Together, they form the architecture of a fallen civilization built on gifts. The sacred turns dangerous not because it reveals itself as ugly or hostile, but because it can arrive with the face of illumination bearing gifts. The desert is important because it is almost the exact opposite of the forge. The forge glows, gathers people, produces tools, and promises usefulness always. through heat, noise, labor, and visible results that impress every watcher. The desert strips usefulness away, leaving stone, silence, exposure, and judgment. A landscape where progress has no place to hide and no audience to admire it. Azazel, who taught mankind to make the earth productive for organized violence, is placed where production dies and nothing can be built or forged anymore. His prison is not a throne of darkness decorated with symbols of power. It is anti-civilization, a place where nothing can be built or taught again. That makes Dudael feel like heaven's attempt to create a dead zone around the source. No classroom, no students, no metal, no ornaments, no sky chart beneath his hand. No audience to admire the lesson or repeat it back with admiration and awe. Only a buried teacher, covered in darkness, unable to watch his legacy spreading. Yet this makes the punishment more tragic and more frightening at the same time, because absence does not equal erasure and silence does not mean the lesson died. The farther Azazel disappears from sight and memory, the easier it becomes for humans to claim the lesson as their own invention and their own triumph. Azazel is chained in darkness, but no chain is placed around the sword he revealed. No chain is placed around the forge that glows in the human night unceasingly. No chain is placed around the star chart copied by trembling hands in candlelight. No chain is placed around the mouth that learns to bless and curse with equal force. No chain is placed around desire when it discovers ornament and display as power. No chain is placed around the human need to control tomorrow before it arrives. That is the final horror of the Watchers, the wound that never closes or heals. The teachers are judged and bound, but the classroom remains open for every generation. And every generation enters without seeing the original door or naming its architect. Heaven can bind the rebel with chains forged from eternal judgment and authority. It cannot easily bind what the rebel taught because memory has no wrists for chains. Every generation copies the forbidden page into the next without naming it forbidden. Not with sacred ink or ritual ceremony, but with habit, trade, fear, and ambition. With inheritance, admiration, necessity, and the quiet assumption that this is simply how things are done. The Watchers do not need to descend again or repeat their original instruction. Their teachings have already become human, disguised as common sense and necessity. That is why a fallen angel is most dangerous not when visible but after disappearing. When he stands before you in rebellion, you can call him a monster and resist him. When his knowledge becomes normal, you call it civilization and defend it proudly. And that word becomes the safest hiding place of all, concealing the original trespass. Make the sharper blade and call it advancement. Build the stronger shield and call it security. Read the sign before your enemy does and call it strategy. Wear the stone that tells others you stand above them and call it tradition. Speak the word that bends another will and call it influence. Take the hidden thing from the earth and turn it into advantage and call it progress. Turn the sky into a map of control and call it knowledge. This is not the story of angels who failed to love humanity from a distance. It may be far darker and more disturbing than that simple reading allows. It is the story of angels who loved power and gave humanity a share of it willingly. They made mankind more capable, more beautiful, more armed, and more deeply afraid. A creature improved into greater danger, sharpened without the wisdom to sheath itself. They made humanity impressive before it became wise, powerful before it became careful. And that ancient imbalance may be the oldest apocalypse still unfolding around us. And when heaven finally looked down upon the world, the Watchers had rearranged. It did not see triumph or progress or the fruit of useful instruction. It saw bloodshed covering the earth like a second flood before the water came. It saw lawlessness wearing ornaments and sitting on thrones built from forbidden craft. It heard the earth crying upward like a witness no court could silence or dismiss. The myth leaves us with a question sharper than any blade forged in any age. What if the things that make us powerful are also the evidence against us? What if the fall did not end when the Watchers were chained beneath the desert? What if it continues every time power outruns wisdom and capacity outruns conscience? Azazel waits beneath the desert stones. The Watchers wait for final judgment. The giants are gone, the flood is past. But the lesson remains, refined by centuries. Refined into systems we rarely question and institutions we dare not dismantle. And that means the most dangerous thing they created was never the Nephilim. It was us, humanity carrying angelic contamination while calling it advancement. This is why the final image should not be only Azazel beneath the jagged stones. It should also be the human world above him. Bright, armed, decorated, calculating. A world unaware that its proudest achievements were first taught in a forbidden classroom. Because the greatest prison in the story may not be Dudale at all. It may be civilization itself, built from teachings that should have stayed buried forever. If this story disturbed something in you, ask which part truly reached you. Was it angels falling from heaven in open rebellion against the order above? Or was it humanity accepting their gifts, defending them, and calling them progress? Leave your verdict below, but choose your words with care and precision. In a story like this, speech is never only speech, and even a comment becomes confession. Subscribe if you want the next sealed file opened on this channel. Monster Mythos does not follow myths into the light where they become harmless. It follows them into the place where the warning was buried, beneath stone and fire, beneath oath and forgotten names, where the lesson still waits to be recognized. And if this episode opened a gate you were not ready to walk through, do not leave it half open in the dark where something else might step through. Continue with Angelology, archangels, angels, and heavenly hosts on this channel. The next angelic truth is already watching from above, patient enough to wait. Patient enough to wait until you stop looking down and finally look up.